Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Chinnery. I'm here coming to you from Cornell Cooperative Extension in Troy, New York. And it's my pleasure to be the host again today for our Lunch in the Garden programs. We have a good number of people joining us today on our Zoom program here, and we do these every Wednesday at noon. And we have a few more coming up in the month of April, so watch your emails and you'll be getting notifications about those. We have 2 or 3 still scheduled for April, and then we'll be wrapping up for the summertime and doing other things. But we certainly appreciate you joining us and being here for these programs. So some housekeeping. If you'd like to see a recording of this program, you can go over to YouTube and type in Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rensselaer County in the search box, and that will take you to the Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rensselaer County channel, where we have all of our gardening programs as well as our other programs archived, and you can watch those anytime you like. So that's on YouTube. Today, if you have a question, you can type it in the chat box, so we'll be keeping an eye on that. Marcy is here, our program assistant, and she's going to be helping us with the chat box at the end. So type your question in the chat box and we'll get to those when we wrap up at the end. And I think we're going to have a lot of questions today, so don't be shy about typing those in. What else do we need to say, Marcy?
I think that you covered it. Our YouTube channel, did you talk about the program will be on our YouTube channel?
Yeah.
Questions at the end. So I think we're all set.
Okay, so I'm going to turn the program over to 2 of our new Master Gardener trainees, Carol and Lorraine. And Carol and Lorraine are members of the Master Gardener class of 2021. They finished their they did their training last fall, starting in September and wrapping up in December. And they put together a program on landscape do's and don'ts for their project. And they liked it so much, they volunteered to come here today and give us a longer presentation. And I think this is a great topic for gardeners, just people even that own a house or own a property, that are, tasked with maintenance of a property, want to make it a little bit better, don't want to make mistakes, maybe new gardeners, maybe new homeowners. So a lot of folks can benefit from some of their wisdom. So they have a PowerPoint they're going to share with us today. So if you, Lorraine wants to pull up the PowerPoint, I'm going to turn it over to you guys. So thank you for being here and taking on a program. So we appreciate that.
Okay, hang on one second here. Now.
Here it comes.
Seeing it?
Yep, here it comes.
Okay, perfect, perfect. All right, I think we're ready to go. Carol?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks. Hello, welcome to our Lunch in the Garden presentation on landscape do's and don'ts for gardening success. I am Carol Ostrowski and my co-presenter is Lorraine Ferguson. We are going to cover some landscaping do's and don'ts that we hope will help those of you here that are new to gardening and those who have been working on landscaping for a while. Why should you care about landscaping? Most people hear the word landscaping and think of outside areas that look attractive and add function and value to your home. But landscaping is not a requirement. There is no law that you have to landscape your home. However, take a look at these 2 houses. They are both fairly similar, but one has no landscaping and one has beautiful gardens. I don't know about you, but I would love to take a stroll outside at the house on the bottom. It's very inviting and the landscaping will attract pollinators and birds. A connection with nature can benefit your feelings of well-being and add peace and joy to your life. You might drive around your neighborhood and notice that some homes have nice landscaping and other homes look abandoned. Some homes have so many trees and shrubs that you can barely even see the house or find the front door. Attractive landscaping doesn't just happen. You can't just stop by a nursery or a big box store, buy some plants and pop them into the ground and expect success. Successful gardens and landscaping require planning, proper plant selection, correct plant placement, and maintenance. Otherwise, plants might not thrive where they are planted or grow too large or become a maintenance nightmare, and you will be disappointed. Gardens are constantly growing and changing. Mistakes can be made, and sometimes they are easy to fix, like simply moving a plant to a different location. And sometimes they are not easy to fix, like if you planted a tree too close to your house. You may not even know you've made a mistake until later, maybe even years later, when that cute little shrub you planted in front of your window just keeps growing and growing and blocks your view. It's easier to plan and research to prevent landscaping mistakes now than to fix them later. Lorraine and I are going to cover some key points of do's and don'ts. Lorraine?
Thank you. Well, I think we're going to start with one of the very first things that I'm going to suggest, and that is to plan before you plant. And I love this quote by Benjamin Franklin: "By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail." I don't think this could be more true than when we think about the world of landscape design, because a lack of planning leads to what? It leads to disappointment, to cost overruns, to a lot of redos in the future. So why is it that we might fail to plan? Well, I think one of the reasons might be due to the fact that by nature, we tend to have immediate gratification. I mean, let's face it, that's kind of the world we live in today. We get a text, we respond to the text, it's all around us. So I think when we look at something visually and we want it, we tend to want it now. So that can be one of the reasons why we may fail to plan. But I think another one might be that we may not know what to consider when figuring out what should be part of our plan. So when we think about planning mistakes, I'm going to be covering a number of things, from looking at your garden holistically to considering a bubble diagram, and also we'll talk about budget limitation. One of the first things we want to think about in planning is to think holistically. Well, what does that mean? A common mistake that's made in landscape design is really a failure to consider the overall space. And that really includes your home style and your structures. Ideally, a good garden design should be, maybe you think about it sort of as a blur between the inside and the outside, where your garden is an extension of your home. So selecting plants that fit your home style. If you look at the photo that we have on our PowerPoint, you'll notice that this is a very traditional home. And when you look at what planting is surrounding this home, we have a very pleasing and synergistic look. Things are pulled together. And that is due in part to not only the design, but also the plants that have been selected. We have hydrangeas, we have some sedums, it looks like we have some boxwood in here, maybe some salvia. So it fits within the structure or holistically into this space. Now, we also might want to, maybe we're living in a home that is much more modern. So in this case, a modern home, the sort of the motto is probably going to be things along the lines of more is less. That's often the theme when we think of modern homes. When I'm thinking about garden design, that might mean that my gardens are going to be more linear. My plantings might include things like grasses. I may have more containers. I'm probably going to have a number of rocks or timber or concrete or lighting that I might have in this space that would be different than if I had a more traditional home. When we think about planning before we plant, not only do we have to think holistically, but we also want to really be able to identify, before we pull out that wallet of ours, what is the purpose of our space. So I want you to take a minute and consider a space that you wish to landscape in your own yard. And ask yourself, what is the purpose of this space? Is it going to be a place where you are going to go to for solitude? Or are you going to entertain friends in this space? Is it a section that maybe you need a large grass area because you have a growing family and they need to play in that space? Is it perhaps to show off your public front yard to those who pass by? Or maybe You're trying to create a private area from prying neighbors. Not only do we want to think about what the purpose of the space is, but also thinking about how do we want to feel when we are in that space. When I think about the photograph that's in the lower right corner, the feelings that I have are one of relaxation and refreshment. We also need to think before and plan before we plant around what is the structure and the hardscaping. In other words, what is in the space today? And when we look at that space, what do we like about it? What don't we like about it? Some of the things that we may not like about it, we may actually not be able to do anything about. For example, I may have a neighbor's fence that we see in the upper left corner that I don't necessarily like, but I need to be able to incorporate that into my garden design. Or I also have in this picture a patio that I'm going to need to incorporate in some way. So I'm not going to take the patio down, I have to be able to design around it. There may be some things within your space that you absolutely love that we want to highlight within the space. So for example, one of those is maybe a beautiful urn, or maybe it's a door that we want to have that we want to highlight in our back area. We also may find that there are areas that we like a part of it, or we feel like it is a good feature, but at the same token, we may not like what the plant is that is in it today. On the other hand, we may very well have a plant such as this redbud that we have here that we want to highlight within our new garden design. So what are the backbones of your space? And also think about what are some of the elements that are going to impact what you plant. One of the things that I know I certainly have failed to do is to look up. And when I'm looking up, what am I seeing? Are there overhead wires ahead? Is there some that would say a large tree wouldn't be a good thing for me to put in this space? Or maybe I'm looking around and I see there's a section of my yard that is shady that I'm going to need to take into consideration. Maybe there's venting or air conditioning units that I wish to hide. So thinking about what exists today and what are we going to do with that structure and that hardscaping that we have. Additionally, what I want to plan for is seasonal interest. Because if I don't plan for seasonal interest, it could lead to some disappointment in my design. There may be spaces within your yard that you're going to be looking at throughout all of the seasons. Maybe it's a window in your dining room or your living room, or maybe it's looking out into your backyard. So when we think about it, we want to understand what are the seasons that we are going to want to be considering plants that will bring us joy in all those seasons. There are also some gardens like in my yard that I never see in the winter because I have a big snowbank. It's usually in front of some of those gardens. So in that case, I'm not going to worry about planting things that are going to be relating to winter enjoyment. One of the things that I have learned over time is that it all sounds good in your head, but until you put it down on paper, it really is just a dream. It's really not a plan. And one of the ways in which we put things down on paper that makes sense is through bubble diagrams. And this is an example of a bubble diagram. And what I'm going to say to you is that you don't have to become a draft person. It really is maybe taking some graph paper, and it doesn't even need to be to scale when we're starting our design planning. But where we start when we put something on a graph paper is we start with what exists today. So in this case, I'm looking at here's what I have in my space today. And usually what happens after that is I might take a tissue paper that I'm going to put over my as-is design, and I'm going to now begin big picture to make some changes. So for example, in my diagram number 2, you're going to notice that there's certain things that have red X's through them. Well, those are the things that I don't want in my space as I design my new garden. I'm also doing sort of big picture designs of where my new space would go. So in this case, we have a beautiful border that's going along the foundation. You're also going to notice that there's certain things within my garden space that I'm keeping, such as that magnolia tree or some other trees along the fencing for my neighbor. And it looks like in this design, I'm going to be adding a new garden that's going to be in the middle of my space. So we begin to design really incrementally and say to ourselves, is this what I'm envisioning? Because it's very hard to do that when it is just in our head. Now, budget. I don't know about you, but I certainly have gotten excited and I've not done all of my planning and I've run out and I've bought a bunch of things and then I get my charge card bill and say, oh no, I kind of think I spent more than I really intended to. Well, the way in which we avoid that is we really want to be thinking and have a budget in mind that we are going to be working with for this project so that you can go back to that bubble diagram knowing what your budget is, and you can begin to be thinking about, will that budget fit everything in my bubble diagram? And if it doesn't, it might mean that you're going to modify your design, or maybe you're going to start with a smaller space in year one, which is certainly better than maybe breaking the bank. So when we think about planning, one of the challenges I had in the very beginning was knowing really where to start and what I even needed to be thinking about. And there are so many resources out there that we can turn to today that have already done so much of the work for us. And that is, I'm going to start with Cooperative Extension. There is so much information that is available at the Cooperative Extension websites that we can look to, as well as different courses like this that we're taking or sessions. I've also taken advantage of garden centers where I have gone to a garden center and I've talked with some of the folks who I know are really experts there. And I just kind of talk about different plants, or they oftentimes will even have a free session, or maybe for a nominal amount of money, you can go to a certain class, maybe on hydrangeas or whatever it may be. One of the things that I discovered that I absolutely love is I just Google garden design questionnaires. And what I have found is that the information that comes back, the questionnaires, which you can often download, have just given me that blueprint, if you will, of the questions that I should be asking as I go along to figure out what my design needs to take into consideration. For some of you, it may not be natural to put together a bubble diagram on your own. So there are design templates that you can also find online. And I've also particularly in the winter, when I'm thinking about what I want for a garden, I will go out and I will begin to collect photos of spaces that I like, and I'll circle what I like on them. Or I will, for example, go to house.com and I will put them in my garden idea book, and then I'll just put a note in there of what was it about that particular photo that I really liked. And I would also say exploring garden trends. There's no shortage of magazines and articles out there, particularly this time of year, that we can begin to get an idea of what sorts of trends may exist in the garden space today. So I'm going to turn this over at this time to Carol, who will talk about some other potential mistakes that we can and how to avoid them.
Thank you, Lorraine. Plant selection mistakes to avoid. Have any of you gone to a nursery and discovered a plant with pretty flowers that you just had to have in your garden? But is that the best plant for your landscape? Is it the best selection? Even standing in that nursery with the plant in your hands, you can pause and take a few minutes to do some research so that you don't make a plant selection mistake. And we are going to go through all the mistakes that could be made. Lack of research is the main cause for plant selection mistakes. First, read the plant tag. Is this an annual, which will only flower for the summer and then be tossed? Or is this a perennial, which will live in your garden for years? Sometimes, even at local nurseries, a plant will be listed as a perennial, but really isn't hardy in our area without special care. If you have your phone with you, do a quick search on the plant's botanical name and see what information comes up. Also, make sure that this plant isn't considered an invasive species in your area. There are places out there that still sell invasive plants, and they might put a little warning tag on them, but it's best just to avoid that plant at all costs. Try to choose something that will benefit the garden, the native wildlife and pollinators. All too often, we select plantings without really knowing that this is the best plant for us. Know your climate. Climate is a description of the long-term pattern of weather in a particular area. The climate zone map, shown here in the upper left, has colored areas showing what zone you are in. Here in the capital region of New York State, we are in zone B, which means the temperatures can drop as low as -15 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter. So plants that are classified as zone 6 and higher will most likely not survive our winters. Areas north and west of us can get down to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. So plants that may survive in, say, Albany, New York, might not survive in Saratoga, New York. So know what zone you are in. Knowing the length of your growing season is particularly helpful for landscaping that includes annuals, fruits, or vegetables. The growing season is the time between the last frost of the year and the first frost of the year, typically May to September. Other wet weather conditions to consider are the high summer temperatures, drought, average rainfall, areas that flood, wind and humidity, and sun versus shade. Even in your own yard, you can have microclimate areas where certain plants will perform well, whereas other plants may fail. Know your soil. Soil can vary from region to region and even from one area of your yard to another. Consider having your soil tested. You can contact your local Cornell Cooperative Extension office about a soil test. On the screen is the link to Cornell Cooperative Extension and the link specifically to the Rensselaer County Cornell Cooperative Extension. You can have a complete nutrient analysis of your soil, and you will find the form, directions, and fee on the site. You can also have a pH test done, which will tell you whether your soil is in the acidic or alkaline range. So, for example, if you have clay soil, it's best to choose plants that do well in clay soil. If you have alkaline soil, instead of trying to grow acid-loving plants like blueberries, choose plants that prefer alkaline soil. It will be much easier and more successful for you to select plants that match your soil instead of trying to amend the soil to suit the plants. Plant habits. Research what size a plant will be when full grown. Start with reading the plant tag, but be aware that some plant tags give you the average height and width that the plant will reach within a few years. It could get much larger than that after several years. So always do an internet search as well, especially in the case of a tree or shrub. Does it spread? Some plants aggressively spread, like some sedums, such as sedum acre in the photo in the middle. You might want this in a certain area, or it might be too much for your landscaping. Other plants spread vigorously through underground runners, such as common milkweed, and are best grown in more wild areas where they can spread all they want. I grow common milkweed since it's a host plant for monarch butterflies, but I don't want it to take over my landscaping. So I let it grow in a wild area where its growth habit is just fine. And in the landscaping, I grow more well-behaved milkweeds, such as swamp and tuberosa. Also, research if plants reseed themselves before selecting them. For example, there are a lot of rows of Sharon shrubs that drop seeds in the fall, and in the spring, up pop hundreds of seedlings, which are very difficult to pull out. There are newer Rosa Sharon varieties available that are sterile, meaning they don't produce viable seeds, so you won't have that problem. Other plants might grow deep tap roots or tubers so that once you plant them, you might never be able to dig them up and move them or even get rid of them. For example, the yucca plant. I had yucca plants that were very happy and they spread and spread. They outgrew the area and we tried to dig them up, but it is nearly impossible to dig up all the roots. So new yucca plants grow from where I thought I had eradicated them. This has been going on for years. So once you plant a yucca, you might always have a yucca. Disease issues. Look for disease-resistant plants whenever possible. It's much easier to research and avoid plant diseases than to be constantly trying to deal with them to keep a plant looking good. For example, powdery mildew. I see it every year on lilacs, phlox, bee balm, and some vegetable plants like squash. But the good news is that there are disease-resistant varieties out there. That doesn't mean that these varieties will never have powdery mildew, but they will be less affected by it. Same with tomatoes and blight. There are blight-resistant tomato plants out there, and though it doesn't make them completely immune to blight, they are more resilient and more likely to produce an edible crop of tomatoes. Pest issues. Imagine bringing home a nice new plant from the nursery, planting it out in your landscaping, and in the next few days, it has been defoliated by Japanese beetles. Yuck. Unfortunately, it could happen if Japanese beetles like that plant. Pest issues are another important thing to research before selecting plants. There are a list of plants you can find online that aren't bothered by beetles, and even plants that repel beetles. You can look up specific plant names and see what pests are attracted to them or cause a problem. For instance, with trees, if you really want to plant a hemlock tree in your landscaping and you do research, you will find that hemlock trees are being destroyed by the woolly adelgid pest. Researchers are working hard trying to produce new hybrid hemlocks that are showing resistance to this pest. So for now, choose another variety of tree or wait until you can purchase a resistant variety and save yourself a lot of heartache and expense. And if you have heard of the emerald ash borer, you know not to plant an ash tree. The emerald ash borer is killing off the ash trees. Wildlife to attract. Think about what kind of wildlife you do want to attract to your yard and plant accordingly. Native fruit-bearing shrubs will attract birds, which can brighten up a landscape as much as any flower can. And birds love to eat flower seeds. So, for example, if you grow coneflowers, leave them standing all winter and the birds will enjoy the seed heads. If you want hummingbirds, you can not only put up a hummingbird feeder, but also plant flowers rich in pollen. There are plenty of good insects that you'll want to attract with your landscaping. Flowers good for pollinators will bring in butterflies, such as monarchs and swallowtails. If you plant host plants for these butterflies, such as milkweed and dill, you would help them by providing food for their caterpillars. And in return, you have the enjoyment of watching these beauties multiply and fly from flower to flower. Wildlife you might attract. Landscaping can be greatly impacted by deer, groundhogs, rabbits, chipmunks, etc. Deer are notorious foragers, so don't plant things that are attractive to deer unless you like feeding them or plan to install very tall fencing. When you see a border of arborvitaes, you will most likely see deer damage unless the shrubs are protected by fencing. You can research deer-resistant plants and find a lot of options which won't be their first choice to eat, and hopefully they will spare your landscaping. Groundhogs will be more than happy to share your plants with you. There are a handful of things they don't like to eat, like lavender, so you will want to research this if you have groundhogs around. If you put in a pond and stock it with koi or goldfish, be prepared for the great blue heron to help themselves to your favorite fish. Ponds also attract turtles, including snapping turtles, which are not fun to have in your yard. Even with a fence, the snapping turtle in the photo on the upper right was trying to figure out how to get into our yard last year to reach our pond. Children and pets in the garden. If children and pets will be around the landscaped area, be wary of plants that may be poisonous if ingested. A few examples are hollyberries, foxglove, lily of the valley, yews, tulip and daffodil bulbs, and some lilies. You can look up potentially poisonous plants online and avoid these to keep your family, visitors, and pets safe. Other plants can pose choking dangers, such as nuts from oak trees and pits from fruit trees. Be wary of plants with thorns so that no one will be injured. Always research and try to think things through when selecting plants. It has been found that some very dense ground covers, like Pachysandra, can be a favorite habitat for ticks. So if you have pets, be wary of that. The dog in the photo on the right is making himself comfortable in some bugleweed ground cover. We have dogs who love to eat tomatoes, so much so that there were never tomatoes left for us. We finally bought a dog kennel and we put it around the vegetable garden to keep the dogs out, but we still let them share in the tomato harvest with us. Impulse buying. Who doesn't love a good sale? I do. This photo was after a fall clearance sale I stumbled upon one year. Even though clearance sales can be a fantastic way to gather cheap plants, you should still take the time to research if these plants will thrive in your landscaping and if you have the right place for them. I might still have some of these plants from this particular haul in my landscaping today, but my guess is that a lot of them did not make it because I didn't do my research. Back to Lorraine.
Thanks, Carol. Research, research, research. Great. I wish I'd known that earlier. I'm going to talk to you about some of the things we need to consider about where we plant our plants. So when I think about my yard, I always think about some of the mistakes that I have made, which is placing things that may be too close to buildings, or maybe I hadn't thought about how big this was going to get, and also some of the synergy scenarios that we need. So I'm going to talk about each of these as we go through. So $750. What does this number represent in relation to something being too close to structures, something planted too close to structures? Well, the answer is probably what you're going to spend at a minimum to remove a tree that you planted too close to your structure. This is a very common mistake. It's certainly costly. I was recently on a walk and I noticed a beautiful oak tree. It was planted so close to a home that its roots were lifting up not only the pavement, but the foundation itself was beginning to crack. Other challenges that this can lead to can include roof damage. You know, if we see a lot of moss hanging over a particular roof and we look up, we might have some overhanging branches which are causing that, or some wood rot, or maybe even providing just too much shade on the home. And of course, we have to consider what does it look like, which can be rather unattractive. This really isn't just limited to trees. We could be considering and planting things that are too close to foundations, which might include bushes or plantings that might block our view as well. So, rule of thumb, if you're considering a tree, you might want to consider planting that tree about 20 feet away from the structure. Now, another thing for us to consider is the root growth tendencies. Some trees and plants are very aggressive in their root growth tendency, while others are less aggressive. Also, we want to consider how fast will this particular tree or bush grow, and the height and width. Now, one thing that I have learned is that oftentimes the width of these roots can be 2 to 3 times the width of the tree. So we want to be thinking about, particularly when it comes to trees that we're planting within our yard. Some examples of trees we certainly would not want to have close to our house are going to be things like oak and poplars and ash. Maybe a better option to consider might be a crabapple, or maybe it's a smaller viburnum bush that we are considering. We also want to consider the mature plant size. And I don't know, there's this Greek proverb that I have tried to live by now, and that is, a society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they will never sit in. Impatience is oftentimes our challenge when it comes to our landscape design. We want to put something in that's going to look great from day one, which means that we may have purchased something that is of a size today that we really can't manage tomorrow. So if impatience is your mode of operation, one thing you may want to consider doing is buying a plant that is closer to its full size when you plant it. And I'll give you an example. I have an area that I'm going to be planting some pinky winky hydrangeas in. And I'm not very patient. I know that about myself. So what I'm doing is I'm buying 10-gallon size hydrangea bushes so that when they go in, they will already be pretty close to the size that they would be. And I don't have to have the impatience of waiting for a smaller size plant to grow. So know your own inclinations and be thinking about the size as you, in essence, it may be that I'm spending a lot of money to buying them, but at the end of the day, I'm going to spend a lot less money because I don't have to replant it in the future. We also, when we think about mature plant size, considering, and again, going back to that bubble diagram, this might be another tissue level, if you will, of my diagram, which is where I'm thinking about the different components or layers, if you will, of what my plant location would look like. So having an idea of what the full size will be will help you to know where within your design you want to plant it. We also want to think about the environment that we're going to be putting it in. I have certainly purchased some beautiful, healthy plants and then become very disheartened when they fail to flourish. And really, as Carol had mentioned, the reason for that is they really are not in the right place. I have a great plant. It would look perfect where it should be, but where I placed it has put it at a real disadvantage. This is a picture of one of my gardens, and in this space, it doesn't get sunlight all day, so it gets some sun, and there are actually parts of this garden that get none. And it also is in a section that tends to get a lot, it's very moist. So in this design, I have elected to go with a lot of hostas and plants that are more noted for their leaves and their growth structure. And I've also incorporated it into it some plants that I know like moisture, which and shade, semi-shade, which is going to be some of the astilbes and ligularia that you may see in this photo. And then we also want to think about synergy. And what I mean here is how unity really in our design is fundamental to tying your garden together. And in this example, it's accomplished through a repetition. And that repetition is of plants and colors. So we don't have a lot of colors here. We really just have purples and whites and greens. And when we do this design, as we're looking at, the textures are also playing a role. They contrast, yet they complement. So we want to avoid too many colors or plant diversity because that can actually cause distraction or give a feeling of confusion when we look at our garden. So if you have multiple types of plants that you like or so many different colors, you may want to actually consider different rooms in your garden, in your space, or different gardens that will contain some of those plants. Here's another example of synergy in this use. We have perennials and annuals throughout. We have pinks that are adding or catching our attention, as well as the curves of the space that are leading us through this garden. And they're creating a focal point from a distance. So we're also considering when are people going to actually be looking, or from where will they be looking at this garden. And in addition, we have different plant forms from round to spreading to tall, with repetition again to create interest and balance. I'm going to turn this back over to Carol, who's going to finish our next topic.
Thank you, Lorraine. Underestimating maintenance. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the landscaping could just take care of itself and still look nice and tidy? But unfortunately, that just doesn't ever happen. There is always work involved and knowledge you need to have. Here are some points to consider. Watering and fertilizing. Who wakes up in the morning and thinks, yay, I need to go out in the hot, humid weather and spend hours watering my plants? Probably no one. If you don't want to be watering, plant drought-resistant varieties, and then you don't have to worry about it as much. For other plants, make sure you are not planting things that need steady watering too far away from where your hose will reach. Otherwise, you will end up lugging heavy watering cans on hot, sunny days. Or you might have to invest in drip irrigation or have a rain barrel nearby. Fertilizing is another fun chore, and it's complicated, which only adds to the fun. Different plants need different fertilizers. Some don't need any. With fertilizing, it is useful to have your soil tested first to see what your soil is lacking and what you need to add. Then you have to research your plants to see what they need. Some plants, especially annuals, will need fertilizing most of the summer to keep flowering. You might want to keep a garden journal and write down when, what, and where regarding fertilizing so you can keep track of what you are doing and what is working. Weeding and mulching. Every landscaped area is going to have weeds, if not now, eventually. Some weeds are easy to recognize, like dandelions, and some sneak in and look surprisingly like real plants. It's helpful if you have a bubble diagram of your landscaping, as Lorraine mentioned, or have plants clearly marked so you know which green things are plants and which are weeds that have taken hold. You don't want to dig out your plants, mistaking them for weeds. Mulching. Mulching is a whole lot of work, and the mulch can be very expensive. But a thick layer of mulch in your landscaping does help keep the weed population down. And if some weeds grow, the mulch makes it easier to pull them out. Mulching can be very hard work. It's more exercise than a day at the gym. Living mulch is a concept taking off to reduce the work and cost of frequently applying other mulches. Ground covers make excellent living mulches, especially if you do your research and match the plant to the location. Some examples are creeping thyme, creeping phlox, bugleweed, stonecrop sedums, wild ginger, etc. Many of these ground covers may even be native plants in your area, which is even better. The bigger landscaping area you have, the longer it will take for living mulches to spread and fill in. But if you start now, you are closer to that point than you were yesterday. Division and pruning. With some perennials, every few years, you need to divide them, which can be another difficult task. Usually, you will need to dig up the whole plant to divide it properly. Then you can replant part and have additional pieces to add to other areas of your landscaping. Pruning. Some plants need deadheading to remove the spent flowers. Some need gentle pruning to stay in shape. Others will need selective pruning at certain times of the year. Pruning has to be done at the right time of the year and in the correct way. It's easier to research before planting than to end up with an out-of-control shrub or tree that you don't know how to prune. And early pruning cuts can make your trees or shrubs grow stronger in the long run. So it is a very important part of maintaining landscaping right from the beginning. Cleanup requirements. Cleaning up your landscaping is not only a lot of work, but it also produces a lot of debris. After you prune your shrubs and trees, where are you going to put that big pile of branches? After you clean up your perennial beds, where do the leaves and stems go? Anything diseased should go in a garbage bag and be disposed of like trash. And the rest? It's not too bad if you have a compost pile. If you have room in your yard, try composting. Composting can range from just a pile of branches with leaves, newspapers, and garden debris piled up on top to a 3-part compost bin or even a commercially available composter that has a lever to turn and mix it up. Some towns have specific dates where you can bag up your garden debris and put it on the curb for pickup. or you can bring it somewhere, but then you might need a truck or a fairly large vehicle for transport. If you were lucky enough to have a lot that backs up to woods, you can probably toss branches and leaves there to naturally decompose in the wild. But know beforehand how you are going to dispose of the debris your garden will create during the year. Personal limitations. Don't make landscaping harder than it has to be. If you are a new gardener, go with easy care plantings with recognizable plants. Try to match the gardener's experience with their landscaping to prevent feelings of being overwhelmed and stressed in taking care of gardens. My daughter wanted the front of her backyard fence landscaped, and it's a long fence line, and there were some other perennials already there planted years ago by the former homeowner, and a lot of very fierce weeds that had moved in from behind the fence. Some of my plants needed dividing, so I brought over a variety of perennials. I was going for a cottage garden look. But the problem with what I did is that in subsequent years, my daughter had to keep calling me for help because she didn't know what was a plant and what was one of the weeds that had creeped back in under the fence. And truthfully, I had planted so many plants, I wasn't sure at times either. So I had confused both of us and had set up a daunting task for my daughter, which caused her to be overwhelmed by gardening. We are going to revamp that fence line this summer with an easier, identifiable mix of plants, and I'll make her a binder which describes what is planted where, including photos and care instructions. I have often tried labeling individual plants, but find that labels fade or heave out of the ground in winter. Had I properly planned and done a bubble diagram, as Lorraine suggests, it would have been much better organized and easier to maintain. Lesson learned. Also, we are all getting older, so keep in mind how much work you are creating for yourself. As we age, digging, pruning, weeding, and mulching will become a burden. Injuries can mean that you can't work on your landscaping for entire seasons. Imagine not being able to do that work yourself. You might have to resort to hiring help, which a good helper may be hard to find. Next slide, please. Will you need to hire a professional gardener, landscape company, or a young adult to help? Depending on how much landscaping you have, the cost could be more than you can afford, and things probably won't be done exactly as you would have liked. Another option is removing some of your landscaping and gardens and replacing them with sod. That will lessen your load and keep your hired help cost down some. My favorite landscaping is don't make your landscaped area bigger than you can ever possibly handle. I can personally attest to this being one of the worst landscaping mistakes of all. When your gardens are a full-time job, you don't ever have any time to just relax and enjoy them. Back to Lorraine.
And that's a very good point. So in summary, Oscar de la Renta once said, "Gardening is the work of a lifetime. You never finish." But we can make decisions along our gardening journey that will bring us joy as we look at what we created along the way. Gardening takes good planning, research, and it certainly takes patience. So in summary, start by really considering your purpose, what the space is. Consider and really do that research before planting so that you have the right plant in the right place. And it is such a garden that you can maintain it without it becoming a headache, so that we can all enjoy the garden. Carol and I thank you for your time today. We appreciate it very much, and hopefully you've got some good tips of things to avoid, and more importantly, some of the areas to help you stay out of trouble to begin with.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Lorraine. I think that was excellent. You had a lot of good pointers on there. Covered a lot of ground too, I have to say.
Yes.
So if anybody has a question, I know a couple of people raised their hands. If you could type it in the chat box, we can ask Carol and Lorraine your question. I just had a couple comments. I love the part about underestimating maintenance. That was great. And really think about what you're getting yourself into. I think that's a really
Right.
valuable piece of information. One other thing that I thought of was that we have our garden tour coming up. We haven't done our garden tour for a couple of years because of the pandemic, but our garden tour will be happening on June 16th. It's a Thursday, and we're going to be in Averill Park, Sand Lake, and Posting Kill. And a garden tour is a great opportunity to see people's landscaping. And really, if you're kind of a nosy person or an inquisitive person, I'll say, it's a great way to get out and see what's going on and see how are other people handling their landscapes, ideas, plants that work, maybe even a few things that maybe don't work. So June 16th is from 4 to 8 p.m. We'll have a lot more information coming up about that. So that's the Rensselaer County Garden Tour. And there's also the Troy Hidden Garden Tour, which is the week before, June 9th, which is in the city of Troy. So I think you guys did a great job. Marcy, do we have a couple questions?
Yeah, there's some questions coming in. I'm going to start with an easy one. What is the garden site on your opening slide?
You think that's easy?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that. That was part of my PowerPoint template that I used. Maybe somebody else knows.
Oh, the first picture?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's Bouchard Gardens in Canada.
Oh.
I'm pretty sure that it is because I when you put it up there, I'm like, oh, that's Bouchard because I've been there. It's in Victoria, Canada.
Well, thank you for answering that one.
I'll have to look again. Maybe after we're done, you could put it up and show me again, and I can make sure.
Yeah.
Bouchard.
Okay, next question is, what is a good resource for finding perennial native Adirondack plants?
I would probably start by going to some local nurseries and inquiring if they carry native plants. You can also research on the internet, knowing your zone. Type in a search for, zone 5 native perennials. You'll probably find a list.
Hey, Dave, what was the name of the garden center? I don't know if they do retail as well for the plugs.
Oh, right. That's a good question.
That
was North Creek.
North Creek. If they do retail, I know they have a lot of native. I would say also just from going to Fadigan's and Zima's, those are two that I know carry quite a few natives as well. And they're very well, they're very well informed.
Yeah, we have Catskill Native Nursery down in Kerhonkson, which is a native plant nursery. There's one called Nasami Farm over in the Berkshires in Whately, Massachusetts.
Oh, nice.
Dawn Foglia has a nursery here in Rensselaer County that grows native plants. I think it's up in the northern part. Well, I know it's up in the northern part of the county. It might be Pittstown. So then I think some people are writing a few more in the chat box.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Okay, ready for the next question? Do you have any suggestions for screening air conditioners with airflow requirements? Plants couldn't be close, but they need to be high.
Well, I think that's always a challenge because of that. One of the things that I have done around air conditioners or things like that is I've also considered plants that are in pots that are of different sizes. And then you can, so for example, I have a very large plant, and in it, I have planted clematis, which is more of a climbing vine. So at that case, it builds some height to it, and I also have some width with that pot, and that keeps it more away from the actual unit itself. That's one example. Carol, do you have any?
I would just say it depends on how much room you have in front. If you can build out a garden bed several feet away, I would think you could plant, some smaller, well, some evergreens maybe that won't reach the unit, and that way you would still have airflow.
Yeah, I don't have an air conditioner, so I can't help you with that one.
Okay, next question. Any good garden forums on the net to look at and join?
I'm going to toss that back to Cooperative Extension, because I know that you guys have a lot of different resources, and I know Cooperative Extension is where I would often start for garden information.
Yeah, I mean, when I look for stuff for Cooperative Extension, I'll type in the question, or I'll put in like native plants extension, just the word extension. And a lot of times you get a lot of different resources from Cooperative Extension that way. And I'm not really a person that does a lot of stuff online looking at other people's websites about gardening. Who is the very famous person? Margaret Roach. I mean, everybody likes Margaret Roach's information. A Way to Garden, that's one of the most popular ones that's from our area. And Margaret has a lot of good stuff on her website. I don't know, Carol, do you have any favorite websites?
And Teresa,
No.
but I do see that Teresa Whalen shared Facebook garden groups, and that I think would be a good idea as well to look into that as well. Yeah. And then of course the local gardening clubs, they may have their own forums as well.
Okay. Somebody is just saying that the National Audubon Society has a plant finder on their website. You plug in the zip code and you can get a list of plants.
Good.
Yeah, that's a good one for native plants.
And I guess the people were putting in the nursery. Somebody said Toe Flax Nursery in South Glens Falls. Wild Things is probably the one that you were trying to think of, David. Wild Things Rescue in Valley Falls. Jesscology in Ballston Spa. And Ewitts, and everybody else is saying, like, thank you, nicely done. And there were several compliments. Bravo, wonderful, very nice.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
How close do you think we should be planting foundation plants to the house? Because that's a question we get sometimes. And I like to keep enough space so I can get back there and do house maintenance. I don't know if you came across any numbers for that.
I didn't see how many feet away or inches away, but I do know that that is a big issue, that people tend to just plant and then they've got a lot of rot. I mean, I have that in my my shed up by the top of my driveway. There are some lilies that have been there for for quite a while, and that wood is just rotting because they're way too close to that building. So I think you do want to definitely have some space and consider that before you begin to put things in there. And the other thing is just the roots. The one thing I did read is if you're putting in smaller bushes that do not have an extensive or a aggressive root system, that you still should be looking at, probably 4 feet, 5 feet away from that house for those types of bushes.
Yeah, I think that's good because, you might want to get back there to wash the windows.
No, we don't want to do that.
I know. Well, who wants to wash the windows? But once in a while, you have to get back there and put up a ladder or something.
Yeah, you might have to.
Yeah. No time to do that. We're always weeding.
No time to wash the windows. That's right. And actually, aren't you absolved of housework if you're out gardening?
Oh, of course.
I believe you are. Yes.
Nothing has to be done in the house.
Right. That's what winter's for.
That's right.
Somebody did put in the chat box that the length of the root zone for foundation. So I think they're saying like length of the root zone away from the house. Is that what that means?
Yeah, I think that's probably the idea is, think about these things are going to grow and then they're going to have a root system. So
Yeah.
put them too close to the building. I think that's a mistake that we see a lot.
Yeah.
People get this cute little thing from the garden center and plop it 2 feet from the foundation, and you know, 2 seasons later, it's too big.
Yeah.
So
And snow falls on it.
so anybody else? Anything else, Marcy?
Oh, that's good. Just like, thank you very much. You guys did great. Very nicely done. So lots of compliments, guys. And I know I really
Thank you.
Yeah,
Great,
it's
thank
very
you.
nice. Very
Thanks.
nice. Thank you.